This Advent season, we've been looking at the story of Mary. It's a story, as I mentioned before, that oftentimes in the non-Roman Catholic world doesn't get told enough. Mary and Joseph become just the prelude to the main story. And yet, as I hope I've demonstrated over the last few weeks, the story of Mary is vitally important, not just because of what her role is in the birth of Jesus, but because of what she teaches us about the spiritual life, about the life of obedience, about the life of faith, about the life of trusting in the Lord. As I mentioned, the story of Mary is disturbing on a lot of levels, not the least of which is that most of us have been conditioned to believe that if God blesses us, that's a good thing. There's no shortage of preachers, particularly the ones that love to run to a TV camera, that will tell you that God just wants to just pour out an abundance on us. If we would just kind of tune the dial to the right channel, God's going to give us everything we could ever imagine. And so we have this illusion that the blessing of God means that it will work out for our short-term interest. And yet, as I mentioned from the outset, the story of Mary quickly puts an end to that idea. Mary is blessed, but at a great personal cost to herself. The angel Gabriel comes to Mary and says, "Hail Mary, full of grace." And then changes the course of her life forever. As I mentioned last week, more than just the fact that here is a young Jewish girl engaged to be married, now finding out she is with child. In many cases, that could have been an immediate death sentence for her. In fact, we're told in Matthew's gospel that Joseph was a good man, a righteous man, and as much as Mary seemed to have been unfaithful, sinful, disobedient, he didn't want her to be disgraced. So even though, being a righteous man, he couldn't marry her, he was trying to figure out, how do I get rid of her in a way that preserves her life, if not her dignity? And it's into that decision-making that the angel comes to Joseph and tries to set him at ease that Mary was not unfaithful, but rather a unique vessel of God. Just because Joseph heard the voice of the angel Gabriel, and just because Mary heard the voice of the angel Gabriel, doesn't mean the gossip circle didn't have conclusions of their own, stories of their own, whispers of their own. And so we find, as used to be the case not too long ago, young girl finds herself pregnant, no husband in the picture, send her out of town. And that's what happened. They had relatives, powerful and wealthy relatives, in Jerusalem, Zechariah and Elizabeth. Zechariah was part of the priestly caste. Zechariah was someone who had a lot of power. I find it amusing that as these events go on, that Zechariah is rendered speechless by God. A few passages before in the Gospel of Luke, Zechariah receives a vision that his wife, in her advanced age, is going to find herself pregnant. And Zechariah scoffs at the notion. They've been trying for their entire marital life, and she's never been pregnant. And while Mary is suffering the indignity of being a young girl pregnant without a husband, Elizabeth has lived her life with the indignity of being a married woman who has not been blessed with a baby. In the Old Testament world, they didn't know of infertility. They didn't know who to blame. They assumed, right, because of course, it was the woman's fault. And they assumed that if a woman was barren, God must be saying something. So a woman who's married, who spent most of her life not bearing a child, lives with a certain stigma. So both Mary and Elizabeth have borne, one is starting to bear the weight of the whispers, one has borne the weight of whispers. Very different circumstances, but still it tells us a lot about being a woman in the ancient world. And so it is. The speechless Zechariah bears host to Mary. And since Zechariah can't offer an opinion, Elizabeth is able to speak into the story. It'd be interesting to know if Zechariah had his voice, what he would have said to Mary. Would he have said, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb"? Or would he have said something more shame-filled, more derisive, more filled with the gossip and the expectations that somehow Mary had been unfaithful, unrighteous, sinful? But Zechariah doesn't get to speak into this story. Elizabeth does. Elizabeth, who's borne the weight of gossip, who's borne the weight of shame, who's borne the weight of her own grief, not being able to be a mother. And she finds herself pregnant. In fact, when Mary comes into Elizabeth's house, Elizabeth is 6 months along, and that baby is active, as we can tell from the story. Mary comes into the house, and the baby leaps for joy, and Elizabeth responds in joy. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, the blessing of God on Mary was nothing but a burden to her. It doesn't mean it was bad, but you need to understand that here went this girl with dreams of her marriage, suddenly the object of scorn and gossip, sent out of town, rather than celebrating her pregnancy like Elizabeth's is being celebrated. Mary's pregnancy is sent out of town so that people couldn't see and people couldn't talk and they couldn't gossip. But beyond that, we're told in the gifts of the Magi as they come to the little baby that's born, that among the gifts that are given to him, given to Mary, are spices suitable for the embalming of the dead. And as I mentioned, when everyone left the grown Jesus who hung bloodied and beaten on the cross, his disciples, some of whom who promised to never forsake him, but they did. They all did, but not Mary. Mary, the one whose life was interrupted by the angel, who was given a gift of foreshadowing by the Magi, who watched her son become this rogue, itinerant miracle worker and preacher, now watched her firstborn son take his last breath. And that was her blessing. And into this, we get the story of Mary and Elizabeth. And this day, as we remember the story of Mary, we remember the story of Elizabeth. Imagine being Mary. Imagine having this part that she's playing in this divine drama that must have her head spinning. And now she's sent out of town to have this baby away from prying eyes and prying ears. And in the midst of this, beautiful, wonderful Elizabeth celebrates Mary and celebrates this pregnancy. Where everyone else might have been shunning, where everyone else might have been judging and gossiping, Elizabeth is ready to throw a party. Blessed are you among women. Where everyone else is whispering, where Mary has to run out of town, Elizabeth is running to Mary, seeing if God could bless her in her old age and in her barrenness with a child. How could God not be involved in this? Elizabeth is a blessing where everyone else is a burden. Mary teaches us how to be a faithful servant. Mary teaches us what we ought to expect out of being a disciple of Jesus Christ. Mary teaches us that if God blesses us, it might not feel so good. If God gives us a blessing, it is always for Him. Remember at the outset that in the story of faith, the story of Jesus born in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago, the story ultimately isn't about Mary, it's not about Joseph, it's not about Elizabeth or Zechariah, it's not about you or me. It's about a God who determined from all eternity to redeem us. The Gospel of John tells us that in the beginning, before God created anything, was the Word. It tells us before God created the first thing in this universe, that God knew He had to fix it once He set us loose in it. The story of faith is not about you and I. It's about a faithful, loving, redemptive God who does not want to see us end up ruined. It's His story, not our story. And because it's His story and not our story, sometimes when God chooses to use us, it's not always for our benefit, it's for His benefit and the benefit of His gospel and His good news and His graciousness toward the world. Sometimes God has to have someone willing to be burdened. The best example I can find in the modern times is the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Many of you know the story, but the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was a German pastor and scholar during World War II. And he found himself caught up in the resistance against Hitler. Not only in the church resistance against Hitler, saying that Jesus was, and only Jesus, was Lord over the affairs of men and women. But he also found himself caught up in the plot to assassinate Hitler. And he got caught up, arrested, and ultimately he was one of the few. As the war came to an end and defeat was certain, Dietrich Bonhoeffer remained on a short list of Hitler's to-do, to make sure of anybody that might get free, it wouldn't be Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was engaged to be married. Dietrich Bonhoeffer had friends. He had people begging him to get out of Germany before it was too late, and he couldn't. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a blessing to his people. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a blessing to the world. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a witness of being light in the midst of darkness, but it cost him his life. He followed the path of Mary, where he was blessed, but the blessing was a burden. Elizabeth is the other side of this story. Elizabeth is the one who sees someone being blessed by God and knows that that blessing might also be a burden, and so she celebrates the faith of Mary. She celebrates the obedience of Mary. She celebrates the fact that Mary was a servant where others couldn't bear the gift. Elizabeth stands as a powerful reminder about who we could be in the life of faith. Elizabeth wasn't a judging presence. Elizabeth wasn't timid. She wasn't quiet. She wasn't holding back. She celebrated Mary. She encouraged Mary. She supported Mary. It's a reminder of the duality of the faith that we live as God blesses us. And that blessing sometimes is a burden. Who among us are lifting up? Who among us are encouraging? Who among us are like Elizabeth, singing praise to those who are willing to be the servants of God? We look at our world right now and there are not enough servants of God. There are servants of political parties. There are people who are servants of their passions. There are a lot of people that are way too angry. There are people who are way too afraid. There are people who are way too disobedient. There are way too few servants of God. And as we see those rare men and women who are willing to sacrifice whatever God demands of them for the sake of God's kingdom, they need people like Elizabeth. They need people alongside of them to recognize that they are a servant of God and to encourage them on their way. It is sometimes a burden to be a blessing. And sometimes when we see people who are burdened by God, we need to sing their praises. We need to cheer them on their way. We need to encourage them on their journey. If we don't have the courage to step up, to surrender everything for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we ought to recognize those few who are willing to and do whatever we can to celebrate their journey, to encourage their faith, to help them along the way. And that's what Elizabeth does in this story. She lifts Mary up. She celebrates as Mary ought to have been celebrated. She brings grace into Mary's story. The world needs more people willing to do anything for the sake of the gospel. And the world needs more cheerleaders pushing them on. Amen.